Hey everybody, welcome to the Friday edition of The Daily Friend. That's right, every week you get The Daily Friend show 3 times a week. That's Monday, Wednesday, and today, the Friday edition. We're going to have a relatively short conversation because I want you guys to segue over to the Iona website and search for the Institute of Race Relations page and essentially just search Daily Friend and you'll find our podcast there. Remember, the podcast comes out every Friday and it's a bit of a longer conversation wrapping up the week. Joining us here in studio, Gabriel, how are you doing?
How's it, Zidle?
Gabriel, of course, is our right-hand analyst here at the IRR, who is joined, of course, by the rather able chief economist of the Institute of Race Relations, Mr. Ian Cruikshanks. Ian, hello, hello.
Good to be with you again. Thank you, Zidle.
Splendid. Gentlemen, I think we're going to have an interesting chat because, you know, it's crunch time. And we're going to begin with the economy because there's 2 things I want us to broadly chat about. You know, one is a very specific example, which I think Ian will hash out for us. But we'll link it to other larger issues that are affecting, I think, the economy and South Africans at the moment. So, Ian, KZN is what we're going to zoom into, and a big corporation down there, Tongaat Hullett, whose share price has absolutely collapsed. Essentially, a self-inflicted incident in that regard.
Self-inflicted is absolutely right. There's been misrepresentation of numbers which have gone into their balance sheet and profit and loss and public accounts. It is a public company. There was a responsibility to shareholders which has been shirked, and I think it can be said shareholders have been misled. This company has been taken off the JSE, and I think management should be held to responsible, and there should be some definite official action taken against them, because the losses have not been due to shareholders' poor company choice, but entirely due to that misrepresentation. And what we've got to look at is a number of people are going to be out of jobs.
Absolutely.
Because they're closing vast stretches of the business. It's estimated it could be up to 5,000. If you say 4 to 5 dependents on every one of these, think of the number of hungry people as a result of this company's management's misdirection.
Absolutely. And if you go down the line in terms of, you know, the profile of who those people may be, some of them are the sort of people who need this sort of work because, you know, they're not particularly skilled and they would have been working, let's say, in, you know, the agri sector that supplies, for example, the sugar cane for a Tongaat Hullett. But there's a bigger issue here, isn't there? You know, it almost reflects, aside from this being self-inflicted by Tongaat Hullett, it almost reflects the general corporate slowdown in the country at the moment. And I suppose Tongaat Hullett just added to that melee insofar as, you know, their share price tumbling, but it also just told the story of the rest of corporate South Africa, didn't it?
Yes, it did indeed. And there's been this move to blame the government, to blame the public sector for the ills of the country. Well, the private sector is not showing up too well in this case. And, you know, you mentioned the skills of the people. A cane cutter, most of the cane is cut by hand. And that just means that there's a lot of people who don't have other skills. You can't redeploy them. What's going to happen? They've got to be fed. There'll be huge demand, huge requests for social grants, more mouths for government to feed, and they will. You could be cynical and say, well, they're the electorate. We have to care for them. No, on a humanitarian basis, you've got to make sure that people are at least fed, and that's going to be a big challenge. Where's the money coming from? What money that should have been allocated to infrastructure development, building roads, railways, harbours, whatever. That's not going to happen. It just pushes us further back in the recovery of the economy. We should have been leading on it's going to be a vicious cycle of less capital employed, less business being initiated, fewer jobs started, less consumer spending. Remember, consumer spending is now responsible for over 60% of all activity in the economy. In some areas, that's going to stop. And then we go, instead of having that victorious cycle, it's going to be a vicious cycle of constriction, contraction, instead of expansion.
Gabriel, I want to bring you in here because we've been having this conversation on the show generally. The idea that, look, the state of the economy right now is just simply not serving both South Africans, the guy who is either A, unemployed, or B, even the guy that is employed. He's finding the cost of living just essentially outpacing his particular income. When you look at and I want us to zoom into the rural aspect of this, because I think that's we've had these sort of conversations. Here's a big corporate player in the sugarcane fields of KZN, large employer, both directly and indirectly. And they very well may, depending on how this plays out, shut down certain divisions. What happens to that poor rural South African in the middle of KZN who, if I want you to link it, already struggles because they don't enjoy certain other rights, like property rights?
Yeah, so here's how it could look. If South Africa was a dynamic, vibrant economy, well-protected property rights, you'd have what Schumpeter, I believe, used to call creative destruction.
Yes.
So you'd have, this business, it turns out it's got bad management, there's greedy fingers in the till, there's lying about where the money's really going. That's obviously introducing inefficiencies into the market. That gets taken out by revelation, by shareholders selling off as fast as they can.
Absolutely.
A lot of fingers get burnt. In a really well-organized system, the fingers that get burnt the most are precisely the greedy ones that were in the till. But then what rises up in its place is fresh investment, fresh opportunities, a great appetite of business to fill in the gap. Because the demand for sugar is not going away, right? But that's not what's likely to happen here. So some of the rural sugarcane farmers that I spoke to over the course of this year and last year who'd had an inkling of something like this coming, were very worried about the fact that sugar mills, a very important cost factor to program into your business is your proximity to the sugar mill and the costing of going to that sugar mill. Now, if a sugar mill is running at half capacity, then it's going to cost you twice as much to go to the sugar mill. And if a sugar mill is an extra 150 k's away, then it might just be unaffordable to get there, especially if the truck might be stolen on the way. So marginal farmers, people who sort of are entering the business but are struggling to make ends meet, who are really sitting on those margins. And to be honest, aside from the very biggest, all farmers really sitting on the margins, but especially those guys, their margins are extremely tight. They're not making it, and their big worries were about sugar mills closing down or sugar mills' capacity coming down, and that's sending the cost per ton of sugarcane production, of threshing it and extracting from the grass stick, the raw sweetie that we like to drop in our coffee. They were very worried about that. And I can only assume at this stage, short of something happening some miracle on the horizon that no one's seen yet, I can only assume that is going to happen, and it's going to knock some of those marginal farmers from being profit-making businesses or flatline making their ends meet, but not really packing on the pounds to going into the red. And without the security that they have, particularly the ones that are kind of farming on communal land, without the security they have to take out a loan to fill the liquidity gap that gets created by this, I can foresee beyond the immediate sort of shutdown of business, I can see knock-on effects for those farmers too, just losing their way and being forced to turn to something else, or I suppose to turn from being entrepreneurs as they are now to being grant recipients, in the hope that in 5 years' time a new cycle is developed and they'll be able to ride that wave.
Colleagues, a final question before we move on. One gets the sense that in such a restricted and dull economy, that all players involved in it, whatever their particular role may be, in other words, those in the corporate sector and business, decision makers there, and those in government, right, the ones who hold onto the levels of power, political power, have a responsibility to create an environment for the individual to be able to prosper and thrive. And we're just not seeing that right now, especially when you look at the regulatory environment, the stifling red tape, the amount of taxes we face, and essentially, I must say this, but the predatory environment, if you will, that politicians are creating. Ian, this plays a major role in overall investor sentiment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One factor Gabriel didn't mention was electricity.
Yes.
in agriculture, yes, it's a major input, especially running the sugar mills. And they're running inefficiently through not having as much throughput as they should. But they're running on Eskom's electricity, Eskom's power supply, and it's going to be less of that at a more expensive rate. It's going to put the mills themselves out of business. It's cheaper to import sugar than to grow it ourselves.
Absolutely.
So this is a major factor there. And so what is happening? The investment community, the capitalists of the world are looking and saying, should we invest? Should we take advantage of this downturn in prices, in values, in asset levels? We say, no. They're saying, no. We just think the hurdles are so high. Uncertainty of assets, irregular electricity supply, labour being far too demanding for their worth. With these factors, we're becoming an unattractive investment destination. And what's happening? Capital is flowing out instead of flowing in and starting new companies and creating new jobs. We're having job destruction, in fact, if anything else. And where's the proof of this? Well, normally on an annualized basis, we get somewhere between 40 and 60 billion capital inflow through the JSE. This year, we've had 60 billion outflow this year to date. That's 100 billion turnaround. That's a massive... How are we going to offset the twin deficits of the current account and the budget deficit? We're going to run out of money sooner than had been expected. And I think that means... get ready for cap in hand to the IMF or to China or some other benefactor that's going to be far more demanding than our present management is.
And that's the story, isn't it, Gabriel? All of this, and the vast majority of this is self-inflicted, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's another crazy stat, which is I saw a report that was compiling foreign direct investment inflows, outflows across the world. And South Africa is one of the top-ranked foreign investors. We're one of the few countries. It's like if you want to find a country that's investing more offshore, that's sending their capital offshore more than us, you have to like look to Luxembourg, which isn't a country. It's like a platform for tax evasion. So all of the money that goes in has come from outside anyway, so it just goes back home. We're you know, in some senses, this country looks like America at its peak. Kind of, it's got so much extra capital that it has to send its capital overseas. Excepting we've got exactly the opposite problem. We've got so little, and it's so poorly guarded that those who still have something are sending it overseas. And it's the you know, there's this. I must just add this story from the rural areas. I was speaking to a farmer who said, you know, the thing about the boiling frog story, you increase the temperature of the predatory environment, but you do it so slowly, and you say such nice things to the frog that they just stay put. He said, have you ever tried to boil a frog like that? He said, because I have. When I had time on my hands, living in the countryside as a boy, we put the frog in the water, we turned the temperature up. Guess what it did? It jumped out. So the capital's jumping out. And it's not nice for the thing that it's the hardest for is people who can't move. You know, when Zimbabwe fell apart, people could walk here. And that was the difference between life and death for a lot of families that were left behind and got those remittances. If South Africa continues down this road, there's nowhere to walk to.
And very briefly, sorry, I did say it was the last point, but Gabriel raises a very important point. You know, the idea of capital leaving, and in fact, you quantified it. And I wanted to quickly just zoom in. You know, two real reasons as to why this is also happening. You know, we've been hearing politicians scaremonger on policy proposals like land expropriation without compensation. We've been hearing those very same politicians, joined by another gaggle of leftist politicians, take it further and say, well, in addition to land expropriation, we're looking to come after your pension as a South African, whether you're rich or poor, by the proposed policy of prescribed assets. Ian, this cannot continue. We cannot continue threatening the saver, threatening the investor, threatening the individual who works and is trying to create value. We cannot continue threatening his property rights, can we?
If we do, what will happen? We're going to have massive social strife. If we think we can avoid the equivalent of a North African spring, we're naive. That's exactly where we're heading. We're not creating jobs. We're not looking after the population as a whole, not looking after them. We're not giving them the opportunity to create their own output. I think that really we're heading for huge social upheaval, and that would be a tragedy. It would ruin our chances of attracting a new growth cycle in the foreseeable future.
Gabriel?
If I can chip in one thing. So like South African, how wealthy is South Africa? It's more or less, let's say, 8 trillion rand. And 4.2 trillion rand is sitting in pension funds. So the prescribed assets thing, it's like so much money has already been stolen. Our net value is less than double our GDP, which is an anomaly around the world. In China, it's 7 times GDP. It was 3 times GDP in 94. Now it's 7 times. So think about how much wealth they've added.
Absolutely.
It's all gone to the private sector. Relatively speaking, none of it's gone to the state sector because they did their Deng revolution. We're doing the opposite. We're scaring capital away. It's less than 2 to 1 of GDP, and half of it's sitting in pension funds. And the one thing is prescribed assets, and the other thing just to remember is this idea of the debt equity swap, where you go from those pensions that are already invested in state-owned enterprises because they're run by the PIC and they've got the buddy-buddy kind of relationship there. Sadly. Instead of getting interest rates every month, they're going to get dividends on the profits, which is Jabu Mabuza, the chairman of the ESCOM board, was happy to say do not exist.
Absolutely.
So this is just another form of public theft of the very last money that we have left.
Yeah. And just very quickly, and as a reminder to you, the viewer, the person watching the show right now, the IRR is running a campaign right now to save your savings, hashtag, if you will. And essentially what it is alerting industry players and industry bodies who are in the pensions and retirement savings industry for them to be part of the fight against any proposed policy to confiscate your pension. And you can join that fight by going to our website, irr.org.za. Have a look at the pensions tab. It's a very concise bit of information that details what prescribed assets the policy means and what it would do to your savings, and then a call to action. Write in, have us write to your fund manager and tell them or ask them what they're doing to protect your pensions. Remember, irr.org.za, and look for the pensions tab and help us fight for your pensions. Guys, let's move on, and I want us to have this conversation because, Gabriel, I think this is something you've been thinking about for quite a while, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of writing. Remember, you can also find our writing on the Daily Friend website, dailyfriend.co.za. Gabriel, on the judiciary, the head judge in this country, the Chief Justice, Mogoeng, releases some comments, delivers a speech during a Mandela Day event a couple of days ago. What are the key takeaways in there, and what was really concerning about what he said?
Yeah, so the sort of, I'm just going, I wasn't able to watch the speech myself, so I'm going off an article written by Hopolang Moloko in the Citizen from yesterday's issue, and the headline is Mogoeng takes media to task. Yeah. And to quote Chief Justice Mogoeng, he said the media's got some, quote, biased coverage. He referred specifically to the Sunday Times report from Jacques Poe that we had discussed on Monday with regards to Keletso Manyike, who was cited by Busisiwe Mkhwebane, the public protector, as being the sort of very important in-depth source for understanding what the real rogue unit was. In her report, she'd characterized him as having paramilitary training, as being some kind of James Bondian spy. And I think something that we had fleshed out on Monday's show was that this picture that the report paints of him as being a James Bondian spy, and then the picture that Jacques Poe paints of him of being a very convivial guy, a Rastafarian dope smoking dude. Again, like, what up to all my fellow marijuana fans out there? Is like it's a very stark contrast. He was a shop steward. He was a people's person. He was a connector. He wasn't a spy. And he had said, I don't know what, when Jacques Poe called him, he said, I don't know what she's talking about. Yeah. We haven't had a conversation. I don't know why she thinks I've got this connection, why she thinks I'm this kind of expert. I was mainly just a translator and a shop steward. And then he said, I think she's confused about me. And the important thing to remember is that from Monday is that he had connected, because he'd had labor disputes, he'd cited a report that said there was the rogue unit. That's why his name was connected to the rogue unit in the first place, and that report was authored by Micha, this guy from 2010 who's been totally discredited.
Right.
So what Chief Justice Mogoeng said, the most important unelected person in this country, is that the coverage was biased. He said it was biased because, I quote, "I was left believing this man is always on a high. I was left wondering why the public protector had to rely on the evidence of this person, but he did not strike me as a crazy man who lived in a haze. Sadly, some of these things are designed to project some in a negative light and others always in a positive light. That is not how we build a nation." So this is concerning. Once again, he's sort of criticizing Jacques Pau for mentioning that Manyike was unemployed, mentioning that he smokes marijuana. I think it is relevant because of the character that it kind of fleshes out. It's not a negative thing. The fact that Mogoeng hears this and was left believing he's always on a high, that's in his own mind. Yes. There's nothing in Jacques Pau's writing to say this guy's always stoned. Yeah. Just like I'm not always stoned, even though I was stoned on Saturday last week, by the way. And then the last thing I want to say is that he's quoted as saying this: when did our state-owned enterprises begin to lose money? Sorry, he's quoted as saying this: part of what we have been channeled to believe is that corruption is only in the public sector. Yep. Now, I hope that the Chief Justice would listen to the Daily Friend show and hear our chief economist, Ian Cruikshanks, saying just the opposite. Yeah. And let me go on. He says, "Let me be more crude and say we have been made to believe that it's a black thing." Yeah.
Quite a thing to extrapolate out of that.
It's hard to process.
I'm gonna nip it over here, just for brevity's sake. But remember, this conversation and in more detail on the Daily Friend podcast, which we'll be recording after this. As we also delve into the issue of the judiciary period, are we getting activist judges or actual judges on issues? Now we're going to flesh that out on the podcast. Ian. Actually, before I get to Ian, it's been an interesting week also insofar as the president of this country, and again, we circle back to the involvement of the public protector. Today she's released her findings against the president and this alleged Bosasa donation of 500,000 Rand. And she's essentially said, that the president misled Parliament over the donation, or his knowledge of the donation. And she makes a whole host of recommendations and in her findings.
I think you were saying before we went on that one of those recommendations is a bit inconsistent.
Yeah, right? the really weird one is she then cites that the president must appear before the ethics committee in Parliament, which is a bit weird because the president isn't a member of Parliament, so he wouldn't have to appear before that. But I think parliamentarians are already sort of like, as you can imagine with this, they're now all sort of going for the limelight, and they'll make they'll clarify that and also suggest what is likely should be done by Parliament to hold the president to account. And I'm not necessarily against that, right? So the public protector, she's put out this report. It now has to be tested in a court of law if the president does decide to take it under review. And simultaneously, Parliament must do what or what it should do to hold the president to account. But the real issue here for me is, here's a president who was sold to us as the new dawn and is going to be the fixer of all things. No. Ignore the fact that he's in the same ANC. He's the guy who will come and fix things. He's the reformer. Ian, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to flesh out the politics side of it with you, Gabriel. But Ian, the investor confidence, if I was an investor sitting in London somewhere and I open up my newspaper and I hear that the public protector of South Africa has serious findings against the president, does this dent my investor confidence or my confidence in investing in the country under this supposed new president?
The answer is it does dent it. And remember that from an investor's point of view, whether it's on the JSE, whether it's in fixed capital investment, whether it's in bonds, whatever, the greatest drawback, the greatest concern is uncertainty. And this is fueling uncertainty. And there's the old expression, when in doubt, stay out. The capital stays away and we don't see it. We don't see what should have been allocated to us, and in fact that gets allocated elsewhere, and we take our own capital, as Gabriel said just now, and invest it elsewhere as well. It just shows the level of uncertainty. Under those circumstances, you're going to get limited spending, less employment, less consumer spending, and so the economy is going to shrink. Like it or not. We've already been told, the Reserve Bank yesterday said growth outlook 0.6% for the year. Well, my calculation says it could be negative. It could be shrinking for the year as a whole.
Oh, wow.
And that is going to be put huge pressure on government to not to seek fancy headlines, but to take some concrete action.
Gabriel, I'm going to switch direction a little bit. I want us to chat about the politics that are likely going to play out here. Number one, and I'll put it to you, here is the public protector, unfortunately, who already has 4 findings against her when they were taken under review that challenged her report. And some of the commentary from the judges when they passed the judgment were like, just what the hell, you know?
That's not a direct quote.
You know, obviously not. But where I'm going with this is, you know, as a member of the public who then reads this report about the president, I'm left wondering if, you know, when this is taken under review, will I see once again, these findings sort of being cast aside and really the reliability and the veracity of her work as a PP further under question. Talk to me about this and how maybe the various different political parties will look at this, you know.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the EFF is probably the most excited about this.
Yes.
I think the EFF thrives on fear and loathing and on a very hardcore kind of cynicism. And I think the EFF did something kind of useful for the country when they said pay back the money, but don't forget that the way that they gained the limelight, the way they made themselves an issue out of that issue was by disrupting Parliament, kind of making it impossible for legislators to do the proper job of Parliament, which is to get on with the process of reasoning and enacting new legislation. I think they'll be looking at the situation and thinking, we can win out of any criticism of Ramaphosa that makes him seem to be part of the old ANC, and especially if it's done in a way that makes it seem as if the old ANC and the new ANC, it's all terrible and there's no way that we can come right with the law and order approach. I think the DA is probably going to try and capitalize by sort of echoing the importance of holding to account the president.
Because it was my money who brought this complaint forward,
But Maimane has also alienated himself from the original bringing forward of the complaint. He's sort of been a bit and ah, which is not totally uncharacteristic of him. But I think part of the good reason for doing that is that Busisiwe Mkhwebane turns out to be incredible, at least insofar as those 4 previous data points go of her investigations being knocked down. Also insofar as her mischaracterization of Hewletts Manyike is to go in terms of the new report against Pravin Gordhan. So the DA is in a very difficult position, and the DA is not at the moment known for turning difficult situations into great opportunities.
No.
So I think they're probably going to be caught flat-footed on this and in 2 minds about it and with more mixed messaging. And I think the ANC is going to continue a very long tradition. Since I do often go back to the moment, I think in 2003, where Bulelani Ngcuka was labelled Impimpi, when he had open investigations into Shabir Shaik and into the then Deputy President Jacob Zuma. And the issue there was that ever since at the National Prosecuting Authority and somewhat now increasingly at the Public Protector, there's been this sense of it's not the good guys and the bad guys. It's Team X and Team Y, and both of them are willing to play by piracy rules. By rules of, you know, if I stick your eye out, then I get to keep your treasure. If you stick my eye out, you can keep my treasure. And then everyone walks around with one eye, and then they walk around with no eye, and then they can't even walk because they've got one leg and then no legs. And that is sort of what's been happening for the last 25 years. And I think this New Dawn story was a story of, no. Now, again, you're going to be able to identify the good guys. You're going to be able to identify the bad guys.
Talk to me, or I'm going to pose it to you this way. You're an ordinary South African. You're reading all of these headlines. You're worried about your own future in the country. you're looking at your own savings and you're hearing the Daily Friend, talk about land expropriation, talk about prescribed assets, what's going through your mind? Gabriel?
Yeah, I think what's going through your mind, whether you know it or not, at some level is, can I afford to think about leaving or not? And if you can afford to think about leaving, then you go down one decision tree. If you can't afford to think about leaving, then I think you start thinking, can I afford to continue to live my life as an honorable person? Or if I'm living amongst thieves, do I have a choice to remain hardworking, to remain dedicated to this classically liberal ideal that through my labor, through my toil, through my risk taking, I can get ahead? Or do I have to start thinking that when you are in this kind of environment with all of the pigs schnoveling at the trough, that the only way I stand a chance of getting some food on the table, the only way I stand a chance of putting food on the table of my children and of my children's children and giving them an education is to join the game? I think those are the main two decision trees.
Ian, I'm gonna switch the question for you a little bit because I'm going to ask you, and again, anybody watching might be thinking, why are we harping on about this issue of investors? But it's very important. Nothing happens if no one is plowing money and resources and capital into an economy. You're an investor. Again, I'll put it to you, whether foreign or domestic, you're looking at all of this and you're thinking, I don't really want to invest. What must government do and what should the country do to woo you back? What needs to happen?
3 factors have to be assured to any investor. First is guarantee security of assets. Forget about BEE. You can't come along and say, if you bring me $1,000, I'm going to take the first 100 and you see what you can do with the rest. And then if the business does happen to do well, come along and in a year's time say, wow, this is looking good. I'm going to take another $100 from you and no, I'm not going to repay you. There's no security of capital, no security of an asset base on which to build. Secondly, we have to be able to offer a guaranteed, constant, reliable, cost-effective electricity supply. Clearly, we can't do that. There isn't often enough at the moment. And the other point is our labor sector has got to understand there's a straight line between productivity and reward. Yes, we want to pay more, but you have to do more.
Absolutely.
And as an example, we had a quote from an American automobile manufacturer shortly before they left South Africa, and he said, let's look at output per person. Despite your lower actual monetary cost base, let's say that your workers are responsible for 2 units output per week. He said, back home in the US, it's 5. 5 versus 2. That takes a lot of difference up in capital costs. And he said, in China, it's 6. Now tell me why you think we should invest and grow a new company from South Africa. No, we're leaving. Locked the door and off they went. After 100 years in South Africa, we can't build on that sort of non-foundation.
Well, guys, thank you very much. We're going to end this one over here. Sadly, a very sad place to end it. But we need you to be aware of the issues. It's not all rosy and fun and games. We're talking about people's livelihoods here. And the conversations may at times seem very academic and high end. But at the end of the day, the effects of what we're discussing here affect you. And we want you to be armed with the good arguments that allow you to be firstly very aware, as I said, and secondly able to tackle the bad policy decisions that affect your quality of life and your standard of living, and get involved in the battle of ideas that we're busy with over here at the Daily Friend, and support us. Please, please, please support us. You can do that, of course, by becoming a friend of the IRR. That is our crowdfunding campaign, which sees other South Africans like you donate between 70 and 90 Rand a month to the cause. And you can donate by SMSing your name to 32823, and an SMS will cost you 1 Rand. Terms and conditions to apply. And if you don't like SMSs, you're very tech savvy, hey, you also have iPads for aesthetics in front of you. Lol, just kidding. You can find us online at irr.org.za/join, and you can sign up your debit order there. Guys, remember, there are other platforms and shows that we put out under the Daily Friend, including the podcast with with Gabriel and another colleague of ours, I can't think. Nick, what's it? You guys have changed the name recently. What's it called?
Right.
now?
So we call it Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree now, sort of because Helen Suzman used to be called the cricket in the thorn tree when she was alone in Parliament for the Progressives. So now we're Two Crickets.
There we go. Two crickets
Progress.
in a thorn. Two crickets in a thorn tree. You can find that under the same IRR channel on Iono. That is IONO website. Of course, Liberty and Friends, a podcast under the Big Liberty Show, is also there, and of course the Daily Friend podcast, which we'll be recording today. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next Monday on the Daily Friend.